Hello, folks. Welcome to our weekly chats. Thanks again for joining me. Today's topic, I, I got to thinking about again. I know we've talked about it before, but it was one of the more popular videos that I did when was starting out with these videos, which has almost been a year now since we've been doing these. But about historical myths and half truths. It's hard to say, half truths regarding history. And I find it fascinating. Sometimes I read some art news articles from the past, or even books where there's articles about local history, and they just get the facts wrong, or some of it's wrong. It's enough that's why I call them half truths, because some of it might be true, but and I'm a stickler for facts, so I like to dig and find if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So hopefully in the description of the video, and if not, after I'm done live, I will put it in there, is to the YouTube channel, specifically back to that original video. Yes, I've been moving some of these videos. Actually, all the videos are on a new YouTube channel. Haven't officially put it out there yet. Still a little bit of work in progress, but for those of you who are nice enough to be watching, I give you a little preview of that, so feel free to go over. It's literally just go to YouTube, Robert Lowell Goller, my full name, and hopefully the channel pops up, and feel free to subscribe. I know some people had said that they find watching the videos over there, or listening to the videos, again, you don't need to be looking at me. Listen to them in the car or while you're doing something else. That it's easier to do it on YouTube. So that's what I did. Plus, Facebook's been a little weird about archiving, and so sometimes I think I'm losing some videos. There are a couple videos actually that got lost, and thank goodness I downloaded them ahead of time. So they're all over there on YouTube. But the first historical myths and half truths video is should be linked in the comments. So over there I had talked a little bit about why it's important that we pay attention. Some people are like, well, what's a big deal if we get some things wrong? Well, if you're trying to make an argument and you're trying to use history to make that argument, if you have your facts wrong, you're going to look dumb, and you're not going to be able to make a good argument. And that was one of the things when I wasn't on a debate team. We didn't have a debate team when I was in high school, but we had a class on public speaking, and part of that was debate. And I'll never forget the teacher saying, make sure you get your facts straight, because the opposition, if they can find out that you have one of your facts wrong, it will completely ruin your argument. So you really have to make sure your facts are straight, and that's why it's important. So I talked about that. National history, there's some things now that people are making claims about what the founding fathers thought. I talk a little bit about that in that video, but also some things here in East Aurora, the alleged tunnel, underground railroad tunnel under East Main Street, and a couple other things. Hamlin Park, there are some myths about Hamlin Park. So if you have the time, listen to part 1. And today we're going to talk about part 2. And some of the things, the reason I'm doing a part 2 is because as I read more things and I come across some things, the list keeps getting longer of some of these things that I'm noticing that are put out there that aren't necessarily true, and I don't understand a lot of where it comes from. Sometimes what ends up happening is people borrow wording and historical facts from somewhere, and if the original source is wrong, the mistake keeps getting repeated. And one of the weirdest, an interesting aside to that is my great grandfather, was the cemetery superintendent here in East Aurora back when we had one, and his last name was Yox, Y-O-X, and at one point someone typed Robert Fox instead of Robert Yox. And now for the rest of history, that mistake keeps getting made. I've seen the wrong name published multiple times. To make matters worse, is there was a Fox family in addition to a Yox family in East Aurora, and there was a Robert Fox. So those things get mixed up. So that's why it's important to double check your sources and to check these historical myths. Another thing why I was thinking about this topic is I've been researching. Some of the things that I've been researching lately have been based off of historical myths. Actually, there's an article that's about to be printed in this week's Easter Advertiser. Be sure to pick it up. My monthly newspaper column about perhaps a myth, maybe not. You'll have to read the article to find out about Queen Victoria. There's a story out there that she apparently preferred East Aurora cheese. We used to be a cheese manufacturing capital, essentially. We were very well known for our cheese, Richardson and Beebe Company on Elm Street. And there was a report out there that Queen Victoria preferred East Aurora cheese. I get to the bottom of that in that article, so I won't spoil it here on the video. But that's why I've been thinking about some myths. So to learn more about that, be sure to pick up the Advertiser this week or read it online. So I got to thinking, and as I was thinking about myths, a couple more popped up, which is kind of interesting how that happens. But I saw a post on Facebook, I believe, or maybe it was Instagram, that somebody had posted about the Aurora Theater and the history of our wonderful Aurora Theater on Main Street. And the claim was, or the description was, that in this caption on Facebook was that the Aurora Theater was built on the same location as what was previously the Millard Fillmore Theater. Now, the Millard Fillmore Theater existed in the 1910s, and it was a vaudeville theater, a wooden theater, so it was not made of brick. So basically a fire trap, that, as many buildings were back then, made of wood. And so that the theater was very outdated by the time the 1920s came along. And so in 1925 or thereabouts, a group of citizens in East Aurora, including Irving and Margaret Evans Price, who were very active in the community, this was before they founded Fisher Price Toys, decided they created this local corporation to build a modern new theater. And that became the Aurora Theater that opened in 1925. To say it replaced the Millard Fillmore Theater is probably technically correct, because the Millard Fillmore Theater, that was the whole point, is to replace the Millard Fillmore Theater, the outdated theater, with a more modern theater. And it would show silent films, and then of course later it became a motion picture and a meeting space. The events were there's been concerts at the Aurora Theater. So they built it to replace the Millard Fillmore Theater, which was outdated. And of course, the Millard Fillmore Theater was made of wood. It was not necessarily safe anymore. We had already lost in 1908, a couple years earlier, or almost 2 decades earlier, actually, lost the Opera House, which was across the street, to fire. So a modern theater was necessary. But it was not built on the same lot as the Millard Fillmore Theater. It was actually built to the west. So actually the law office that is next door, there's an alley in between the theater building and the law office next door. That's where originally Millard Fillmore's house was, and they moved it to the back, and then later it was moved to Shear Avenue. And they built a theater there, and in the 1910s, and they named it the Millard Fillmore Theater because it was originally where Millard Fillmore's house was, and he owned the lot there. When they replaced it with the Aurora Theater, they built the Aurora Theater next door and continued to have shows and silent films at the Millard Fillmore Theater. And literally, one weekend they had a show at the Millard Fillmore Theater, and the Aurora Theater was ready the next weekend, and they moved it. The first showing in the new Aurora Theater was next door. And that Millard Fillmore Theater, the wooden building, was changed quite a bit. They took the top off, essentially, because it was this tall building with a stage and theater screen. And it became a grocery store, an old-fashioned grocery store, and then today it's an office. So that parts of that building are still there. So actually what probably prompted the erroneous information that was on Facebook recently is that the theater's own website actually has that it's on the lot of the original Millard Fillmore Theater. And to be fair, that has been something that people have talked about because and said is true when it's really not true. But to be fair, I think it's because of that. It's all about the wording that they would say that the Aurora Theater replaced the Millard Fillmore Theater. Well, it did as a venue, but it's not on the same lot, and it didn't actually replace the building. So when you hear that information is actually wrong. So the Millard Fillmore Theater the building is next door to the what is Aurora Theater today. And actually, the Aurora Theater's website has an old picture of the Millard Fillmore Theater, and kind of describes the fact that uh, in its history section, and describes the fact that the building, the Aurora Theater building, is on the same lot, and replaced the building that they're showing from the archives of the historian's office, when in fact that building is still there next door. So that's a historical myth that keeps getting perpetuated quite a bit. But the two different theater buildings, and on two separate lots just happen to be next door to each other, which kind of leads to that confusion. So that gets repeated quite a bit. Another myth that has kind of amazes me, but I take for granted that we all know this, and I saw it in a real estate listing. And a lot of times, real estate listings will borrow. Sometimes they take word for word some author's writings, which is a problem. But they'll take the wording of that's a topic we'll talk about another time, is sourcing your materials and copyright infringement. That might be an interesting topic. But this real estate listing was talking about East Aurora and what a wonderful community is, and it is. And they were talking about the history of the community, try to entice someone to buy a particular house in East Aurora. And they have a little community profile. And in that community profile, they say that Millard Fillmore, that East Aurora was the birthplace of Millard Fillmore. No. Millard Fillmore was actually born in a town called Locke, New York, which is out toward the Finger Lakes, actually near where the other Aurora is, the village of Aurora. And we talked about that a few weeks back. But he was born in the Finger Lakes. His family, facing his father and uncle facing financial difficulties, actually moved from the Finger Lakes to here. And Millard Fillmore, at around the age 20, walked here and met his family here. And his father owned land out on where Olean and Lapham Road meet. And Millard Fillmore walked here in his 20s, or at age 20. And we know this because he was asked to write his early life memoirs later in his life. And so that's how we know much about what happened in his life. Moved here, he had met his who became his wife, Abigail, in the Finger Lakes, brought her here, and built the house that is still today is a museum, which stood where the Millard Fillmore Theater was. And he actually only lived here about 10 years. So he came here in about 1820. He built, got married, and in the Finger Lakes region, moved with his wife here, built her what they called the honeymoon cottage, which is what we know today as the Millard Fillmore house, in 1826. And they only lived in that house for 4 years, and before they moved to Buffalo. He did a lot here. He started his congressional, or he ran for state assembly. He began his political career here. He began his law career here. But he wasn't here for a very long time in relation to his entire life. So he lived here for 10 years, lived in the house that he built for 4 years, between 1820 and 1830 is when he lived here in East Aurora. But he was not born here. Again, this is one of those things, I saw it on the internet, where one source said that Millard Fillmore was born here in East Aurora, New York, and it appears that people are just cutting and pasting and copying when they're writing up profiles of our community, and just cutting and pasting. So you really got to check your sources, and it becomes obvious sometimes when you just cut and pasted. My college professor reminded me of this, reminded all of us of this during that once a semester speech about plagiarism that we got, was that it's very obvious that you've lifted something from a website or other source if you get the facts wrong and you're copying the exact same mistakes. Because if you did research, you would find out that wasn't true. So you're just lifting mistakes. So Millard Fillmore was not born in East Aurora. So if you see that anywhere, no, that's not true. And lastly, one of the reasons this topic comes up quite a bit in my own head is that recently another myth that, as those of you who've been reading the newspapers, a cabin that was up on Hubbard Road, the town board determined that it was beyond repair and took it down. And it was known, it had been, folks had continued to call it the Hubbard cabin, uh, which led to a lot of people thinking that it was Elbert Hubbard's cabin. And in some cases, people were thinking that that's where Elbert Hubbard wrote a lot of his writings. Actually, the Little Journeys cabin, where he did allegedly write a lot of his Little Journeys essays, that's long gone, but it was in a different location. That cabin that was in the news recently up on Hubbard Road was not Albert Hubbard the First's cabin. It was his son. His children built it. Yes, there were Roycroft meetings there. It has a Roycroft connection. The Hubbards actually bought Albert Hubbard and his wife, the second, Albert Hubbard the second, known as Bert, and his wife bought that land after 1915. So Albert Hubbard, his dad, did not have anything to do with it. In fact, the property records indicate that it was not owned before 1915 by anyone in the Hubbard family. So any connection to Albert Hubbard I is just not based in fact. 1915, of course, Albert Hubbard I died on the Lusitania. The cabin got mixed up. People kept calling it the Hubbard cabin, and then you read in local history books about Albert Hubbard's tradition and tendency to go off into a cabin in the woods and write, and he did do that, but not in this cabin because it was built later. The Little Journeys cabins and other cabins that you might see in books and articles about the Roycroft are totally different. But that myth got perpetuated because people were just calling it the Hubbard cabin. And so if someone heard Hubbard cabin on Hubbard Road, they would Google Hubbard cabin, and the Little Journeys cabin would pop up and photos of that. Two different cabins. Now, a lot of folks were claiming that and arguing that myself included, that building was still historic, parts of it anyway. But because of its connection to Bert Hubbard and later Roycrofters, you couldn't hang your hat on the argument that it was Albert Hubbard's cabin, because it just simply wasn't true. So it could still be historic, but not because it was Albert Hubbard I's cabin. So that was a myth that kept getting perpetuated. Of course, the town board and the town had to make an argument. It was in very bad shape, and had to make an argument whether or not it was able to be saved. But people were asking whether it was historic or not. Historic is a subjective term in many respects. So every place has history. That building perhaps had more history than others, but it didn't have Albert Hubbard I's history. So I had actually heard people say that we should save that building because Albert Hubbard wrote his manuscripts there, and that's simply not true. We might have wanted to save it for other reasons, but not because it was Albert Hubbard I who wrote the Little Journeys there. So that's another myth that I've come across in recent months. So if you have more, please let me know. I love to talk about these things. It's part of my, number one, part of my job, but also part of what I love to do is to track down the truth in our local history books, and sometimes those myths get repeated over and over again, and when you go back to the original newspaper articles of when the event actually allegedly happened, you find out it happened in a different way or didn't happen at all. So thanks again for joining me. Again, if you have any comments or questions, I have gotten some really great comments in private messages, some great ideas. So I'm putting them in the hopper. Some of them are going to take me a little more research or a little more thinking. Some folks have asked me my opinion about current events and how they relate to history. I'm I'm thinking. I'm working on it, and there are going to be topics coming up. So I just don't want to be spouting off without doing proper due diligence and research on some of these things. I want to really think about it. One of them was it was funny. Two different people asked me within the last week what my opinion on as a historian and what historians' opinions are on artificial intelligence, which is a great topic. So that will come up soon. Again, just a caveat, these videos, I am the town and village historian, but these videos I do on the side, so anything that I say here is not related to my official duties as town and village historian. Thanks again for joining me, and we'll see you next time. And please feel free to pop comments in the comment section or send me a private message. Have a good one.